A quiet afternoon, in the Greenfield neighborhood, suddenly turned chaotic when a police car pulled up in front of Nia Thompson's house, a black woman, just because she was changing her Wi-Fi password. She wasn't loud. She wasn't causing any disturbance. Yet that one simple action was enough for someone to label her as suspicious. But, what truly shocked the police wasn't Nia. It was what was hidden behind that Wi-Fi signal. A strange device, an obscure network, and someone, silently monitoring the entire neighborhood through each home's security cameras. And when that person's identity was finally revealed, it left everyone speechless. Because danger doesn't always come from the person you suspect. Sometimes, it comes from right inside the place you thought was safest. Nia Thompson lived alone, in a small gray house in the Greenfield neighborhood of Missouri. A calm and reserved black woman, she chose to work from home, stay away from noise, and keep her life neat and orderly. To Nia, privacy wasn't just a habit. It was something essential to feeling safe. She wasn't close to her neighbors. She rarely showed up at any of the neighborhood parties. People got used to seeing her quietly come and go, taking out the trash, picking up deliveries. Other than that, it was as if she had vanished from the outside world. No one complained, but no one truly understood her either. One day, while taking a break from work, Nia noticed her internet connection was unstable. Her video calls were lagging, emails kept failing to send, and even streaming music kept cutting out. At first, she thought the network provider was having issues. But after several interruptions, a sense of unease started to creep in. She picked up her phone and accessed her router settings. Nia wasn't a tech expert, but she knew enough to spot something that didn't belong. In the list of connected devices, there was one strange name, Greenfield I01. It didn't look like a random string of numbers. It looked like someone had deliberately named it to be recognizable. She had no guests, hadn't shared her network, and was absolutely certain she hadn't given anyone access to her Wi-Fi. Feeling violated, Nia decided to reset her entire password to cut off any unfamiliar devices. She stepped outside for a better signal, standing under the awning, carefully typing in each character on her screen. A light breeze passed through the tight knot of her hair, and the late afternoon sun lit up her calm face. Everything seemed simple, until a silent gaze from across the street started to follow her every move. And from that very moment, the peace Nia had protected for 3 quiet years, began to crack. Richard Palmer, a middle-aged man living directly across from Nia, was the type who noticed every little movement in the neighborhood. He liked the feeling of control, liked knowing who was doing what, and especially disliked people he considered different. To Richard, Nia Thompson fit that label perfectly, a black woman living alone, quiet, never chatted, didn't join community events, skipped Christmas gatherings, and didn't even greet him when passing by his house. He had never seen her cause trouble. No one had ever complained about her. But it was exactly that silence that made him uneasy. It felt abnormal. And that afternoon, when Richard happened to glance out his living room window, he saw Nia standing in her front walkway, typing continuously on her phone, eyes glued to the screen. She occasionally paused to look up, then kept typing. She had been standing there for nearly 10 minutes and hadn't moved. A strange feeling welled up in Richard's chest. He couldn't explain it, but a familiar thought echoed in his head, something's not right. He frowned, pulling the curtain down slightly, his eyes still fixed on the quiet woman. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from the belief he was witnessing something suspicious. Without hesitation, Richard picked up his landline and dialed 911. His voice, usually slow and steady, now carried urgency and a tinge of confidence, like someone convinced they were doing the right thing. "I'd like to report suspicious behavior," he said. "There's someone standing outside, she looks very suspicious." The dispatcher asked, "What is she doing?" Richard hesitated. She's using her phone, but something feels off. She's just standing there. I don't know, it doesn't seem normal. When asked if she had any weapons or if he heard arguing, Richard couldn't give a clear answer. All he had was a feeling that something wasn't right. Meanwhile, Nia was still focused on her phone screen. She was inside her router settings, trying to find the verification code needed to change the network password. The process required concentration, so she wasn't paying attention to her surroundings. Everything felt routine, except for a creeping discomfort in her chest, as if someone was watching her. Less than 5 minutes later, 2 patrol cars pulled up in front of her house. The car doors opened, and 2 officers stepped out. A tall man with a stern face, Detective Lucas Navarro, and beside him, Officer Jenna Carter, smaller in build but with sharp eyes and constant alertness. Navarro walked slowly toward the house, eyes fixed on Nia. His hand didn't rest directly on his gun, but it was clear he was ready to react. His voice rang out, clear, calm, but with a tone that made it feel more like an interrogation than a question. "Ma'am, we received a report of suspicious activity. Can you tell us what you're doing here?" Nia looked up, her brows furrowed slightly. Her gaze shifted between the 2 officers. Confusion hit first, then uncertainty, then slowly gave way to a deeper feeling, hurt. "I'm changing my home Wi-Fi password," she answered, trying to keep her voice steady despite the emotions welling up inside her. A simple act, done in her own front yard, had suddenly become a reason for the police to question her, in front of her neighbors, without anyone asking why. Just because she was different. And from across the street, the cold gaze still lingered on her, as if Richard truly believed he had done the right thing. The door across the street swung open. Richard Palmer, shirt buttoned to the neck, still holding a dish towel, stepped out with a tense expression. He stood straight on his porch, eyes locked on Nia, his voice sharp and almost accusatory. "She's always out there on her phone. Yesterday, too. The day before. I'm telling you, something shady is going on." Navarro glanced at Richard but didn't react. He'd heard this kind of statement before, especially from people who thought they were helping. But Nia froze. She turned to face Richard, her eyes steady and unafraid. Her face was calm, but her lips pressed tight, as if holding something back. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said quietly, slowly, trying to contain her emotion. "There's a strange device connected to my Wi-Fi. I don't know what it is. It's not mine. I'm trying to remove it." Richard raised an eyebrow, squinting slightly. Then came a dry, dismissive laugh, sharp and brittle like a crack in the air. "Really?" he said with a scoff. "Everyone blames technology these days. Sounds like a movie. A weird name in your Wi-Fi? Please. Sounds like an excuse." The sarcasm in his voice made the air heavier. Carter frowned slightly. Navarro turned back to Nia, his tone softer now, but still firm and investigative. "Ma'am, would you mind letting us take a look at your router settings to verify?" Nia paused. She clearly wasn't pleased. Her eyes lowered, not out of anger, but from exhaustion. Exhaustion from having to prove herself right when she had done nothing wrong. Still, she nodded, opened her phone silently, navigated to her network settings, and handed the screen to Navarro. Navarro took the phone. Carter leaned in to look. On the screen was a basic list of connected devices. Near the bottom, one name stood out clearly, Greenfield I-01. Navarro tilted his head slightly, lips pressed together. He said nothing, but his expression changed. Carter quickly switched to the connection history. She scrolled, then stopped. "It's still connected," she said under her breath, eyes glued to the screen. "It hasn't dropped once. It's been in the network since this morning. Maybe since yesterday." Richard began to shift on his feet, his gaze flickering. He no longer stood firm in the role of concerned neighbor. A part of him now seemed afraid, not sure if he feared the truth, or the possibility he'd been wrong. Navarro handed the phone back to Nia. He paused, then asked, "This isn't your device, correct?" "No," she replied, her eyes locked on his. "I live alone. I have a phone, a laptop, and a TV. Nothing else." The front yard fell into an eerie silence. Richard said nothing. Carter scanned the area, as if mentally rewriting everything they had assumed. And in that silence, suspicion began to shift. No longer focused on the black woman standing in the golden light of dusk. Now, the attention drifted elsewhere, towards something invisible. An anonymous device. An innocent-looking name. And a hidden hand, quietly pulling the strings from behind. The tension settled over the house like a heavy fog. No one was speaking. Only silence clung to the air above the small porch. Nia took a deep breath, her voice lowering, tinged with both fatigue and caution. "I don't think it's just my Wi-Fi that's been breached," she said, eyes scanning her phone screen, fingers moving quickly. "I think someone's accessed my home security system too." Navarro stepped closer, watching her actions closely. Nia opened the access log in her security camera app. A list of login times appeared. She scrolled down. Then suddenly, her eyes froze. Her fingers stopped moving. A breath caught in her throat. She stared at a single line in the log. The login time, IP address, and location were all clear. But it was the status next to it that left her numb: live view, bedroom camera, living room camera. She didn't say anything more. Just switched to playback mode. On the screen, video clips began to appear. Angles from the living room, bedroom, even the front door. None of these were hers. These were not her views, not her activity. Someone else had been in her system. Quietly. Steadily. For days. Carter stepped in closer, her face darkening. "Someone's been controlling your cameras remotely," she said slowly, as if still processing. "They weren't just stealing your Wi-Fi. They were watching you." Navarro nodded, lips tightening. "This isn't a neighbor dispute anymore," he said, eyes still locked on the screen. "This is cybercrime. And it's serious." A voice from behind startled them. It was Melanie, a nearby resident, who had been silently watching everything unfold. Her voice trembled slightly, fear mixing with disbelief. "Wait, does that mean they might have been watching my house too?" Nia didn't answer. She opened the log again, this time, the list of IP addresses the unknown device had accessed. Several entries popped up. Each one linked to a home. Then, she stopped. A familiar IP. Another video played. The footage shook slightly, daylight glowing behind white curtains. A beige armchair. A painting on the wall. Richard stepped back, face drained of color. "Wait, that's my living room." No one said a word. The screen kept playing the silent footage. But that very silence sent chills down everyone's spine. Every assumption they had made collapsed. This wasn't about Wi-Fi theft. It wasn't random mischief. It was a coordinated surveillance operation, silent, methodical, violating the most private places in their lives. Navarro turned to Carter, urgency flashing in his eyes. "We're at the center of a widespread surveillance case," he said. "And whoever's doing this, isn't far." A heavy silence settled over the entire street. The truth was emerging. But the terrifying part was, it wasn't over yet. Detective Navarro reached for his radio, his voice cutting clearly through the quiet afternoon. He reported the situation and requested immediate dispatch of the cybercrime investigation team. There was no longer any doubt, what was happening wasn't an isolated glitch. It was a sign of a calculated, organized surveillance effort, quiet, and dangerous. While they waited, no one spoke. No one moved. The breeze rustled through the trees, but it wasn't enough to ease the tension blanketing the small street. Nia sat on the front steps of her house and opened her laptop. Her expression was no longer just puzzled, it had turned into razor-sharp focus. Her fingers moved swiftly, confidently across the keyboard. She accessed her router's management system and pulled up the remote access logs. A list of IP addresses filled the screen. Many were familiar, devices she recognized. But one address kept appearing over and over, at irregular hours and with worrying frequency. It hadn't only been active during the day. It had connected late at night, when everyone else was asleep. Nia's gaze sharpened. She launched a network signal analysis tool, filtered the data by time, and narrowed down the signal strength by range. A few minutes later, a miniature map of the neighborhood appeared. A blinking red dot pulsed steadily. She zoomed in on the area. Her lips tightened, then she spoke loud enough for both Navarro and Carter to hear. "The signal is coming from right here in the neighborhood. Specifically, house number 87. All three turned toward where Nia pointed. A two-story home with a brown tile roof came into view. It was Richard Palmer's house. No one spoke at first. But Richard's expression had changed. His eyes darted back and forth, lips moving slightly as if scrambling for a response. "No, no way," he stammered. "There's nothing strange in my house. It's always been the same." Nia didn't respond. She kept checking the logs. She traced the internal IP address, then stared at the screen. "Second floor," she murmured. "The device is on the second floor. Not the living room. Not the kitchen. Upstairs." Richard stood frozen, confusion spreading across his face. He turned away, avoiding everyone's gaze, then suddenly shook his head harder, his voice louder, but shaky. "No way. Kyle lives up there. He's just an IT student. He's respectful. Smart. He wouldn't do something like that." Navarro said nothing. He looked at Richard with a heavy but non-judgmental stare. He had seen it many times before, cases where the suspect wasn't a stranger but someone within the family. Carter stepped forward, her hand resting gently near her belt, ready for anything. "We need to check. Now," she said firmly. Nia closed her laptop and stood. Her face showed no more fear. She knew. And now it was time to confront it. There was no doubt anymore, the person behind it all, was very, very close. No one said a word as the group left Nia's yard and crossed the street toward house number 87. Richard's pace slowed with every step, as if his legs were weighed down. He had never imagined the day would come when he'd lead police into his own home to confront someone he loved. Navarro walked ahead, eyes sharp. Carter followed beside him, her hand still close to her side. They weren't guessing anymore. Now it was time for answers. Richard unlocked the door and pushed open the heavy wooden frame. Inside, the house was eerily silent. Only the ticking of a wall clock and Richard's shaky breathing filled the space. They entered, heading straight up the stairs toward the second floor. Navarro stopped in front of a closed door at the end of the hallway. He knocked 3 times, loud and firm. The knocks echoed. "Kyle, this is the police. We need to speak with you." No reply. Only the faint scrape of a chair inside. A small sound, but enough to heighten everyone's alertness. Navarro knocked again, this time more forcefully. "If you don't open this door, we will be forced to break it down." Silence. Then slowly, the doorknob turned, and the door creaked open. Kyle Palmer appeared behind it. His face was pale, eyes unfocused, lips trembling like he had just woken from a nightmare. What's going on?" he asked, voice shaky, trying to stay composed but clearly rattled. Navarro didn't dance around it. He took a few steps into the room, looked Kyle directly in the eye. Have you been accessing the security cameras of homes in this neighborhood? Kyle swallowed hard. His eyes flicked to Carter, then stopped at Richard, his uncle, standing just behind the officers, fists clenched, eyes filled with disbelief and pain. I don't know what you're talking about. You don't have a warrant, Kyle stammered, his voice weakening. Navarro crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly, as if offering one last chance. We have enough cause to get a warrant immediately. But if you want to cooperate, if you want leniency, then you need to tell us the truth. Right now. The air thickened. Kyle stood motionless for a few seconds, then exhaled deeply, his eyes starting to sink. At first, I was just messing around. I wanted to see if I could get into someone's Wi-Fi. Just for fun. Then I saw the cameras, and I got curious. His voice dropped lower, as if even he couldn't believe what he was admitting. I didn't mean to do anything bad. But I couldn't stop. Richard stepped back, his face pale. He looked at the nephew he once admired, thoughtful, kind, tech-savvy. Now, standing before him, was someone completely different. Someone who had invaded the privacy of their entire community. Carter didn't wait another second. She stepped forward and pulled handcuffs from her belt. Kyle Palmer, you are under arrest for unauthorized access of a computer network and unlawful surveillance. The sound of metal echoed through the quiet room. Kyle didn't resist. He bowed his head as Carter read him his rights, each word slicing through the air like a knife, cutting into the truth Richard didn't want to accept. Navarro glanced at Richard. He said nothing. He didn't need to. There were no words left to defend the unforgivable. The truth was out. But the deepest pain wasn't that Kyle had committed a crime, it was that Richard had never seen it, even though it was right in front of him all along. Kyle was escorted out the front door, his hands cuffed tightly, his head bowed. The golden light of the setting sun cast a slanting shadow across his pale face, stretching across the brick pathway like a fading mark. He said nothing. No apology. No plea. Just silence, with Officer Carter's steady footsteps echoing behind him. The shame hung heavy on his shoulders, so tangible that no words were needed to know what he was feeling. Richard stood on the front steps, one hand trembling slightly as he gripped the door frame to keep himself upright. His face was ashen, eyes hollow as he watched each step of the nephew he once trusted completely. Kyle never looked up at him. There were no words left between them. Only disappointment, grief, and guilt, tangled together, clinging to Richard like a sentence with no appeal. Nia remained in her front yard, the same spot where the entire afternoon had begun with a simple act of changing her Wi-Fi password. She didn't step forward, didn't turn away. Her face was calm, but in her eyes, a silent sting lingered, burning slowly like embers in her chest. The accusations, the suspicious glances, the sound of police sirens, all still echoed inside her. Navarro turned back and walked slowly toward her. He gave her a firm, heavy nod. Because of you, this was uncovered. She looked at him, but didn't respond. She didn't need thanks. She didn't need anyone to affirm she had been right. What she had always wanted was simple, to live in peace, without judgment, without being defined by her silence, or her skin. She turned her gaze toward Richard. It wasn't harsh nor resentful, but clear and unwavering. Then she spoke, slowly, each word falling like a weight between them. I had the police called on me, just for changing my Wi-Fi password. Richard couldn't lift his head. He just stood there, shoulders sagging. His eyes lowered, hands limp by his side. A single sentence, yet heavier than any reproach. He wanted to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Nothing he could say would excuse the ignorance he had allowed to take hold. The police led Kyle down the stone path. The gate opened, then quietly clicked shut behind them. That sound wasn't loud, but it was enough to jolt the whole neighborhood awake. Behind drawn curtains, through half-open windows, eyes had been watching all along, quiet, stunned. The neighbors had stood witness to everything. No one spoke. No one dared ask. One person arrested. Another humiliated. And the one they had suspected, was the one who had unveiled it all. This story began with a single, prejudiced glance. A needless phone call. But as the truth was laid bare, it led to something far greater, a quiet crime that had been unfolding at the heart of a seemingly safe, trustworthy community. Not from outside, but from within. Richard stood still in the walkway, watching Kyle's figure fade behind the police car. His heart felt hollow, every step he took weighed down by things left unsaid. Then, as if pushed by something deep inside, he slowly walked toward Nia. Nia was still standing in the front yard, her hand resting lightly on the wooden bench, eyes gazing into the distance. She heard his footsteps, but didn't turn. Richard stopped a few feet from her, his face caught between remorse and anguish. He opened his mouth, hesitant, as if each word was stuck in his throat. Nia. But before he could finish, Nia spoke, her voice soft, not cold, not sharp, but calm, like a truth she had held inside for a long time. I don't need an apology. Just don't look at people with prejudice anymore. That sentence fell into the space between them. No raised voice, no anger, but it hit hard enough to leave Richard silent. He bowed his head, didn't reply, only gave a small nod, as if finally accepting a truth far too late. Behind them, the neighborhood began to stir. Doors creaked open, people stepped outside. Neighbors gathered slowly, whispers spreading across lawns, questions with no answers rippling through the crowd. Everyone was stunned. Everyone thought they knew those around them. But today, they realized, there were things quietly happening behind every closed door. Carter stepped into the center of the group, her tone serious and clear. We strongly advise everyone to change your Wi-Fi passwords, update your router security, and do not share your network with anyone you don't fully trust. This is no small matter. Navarro stood beside her and added firmly, the investigation will continue. We can't be sure Kyle was the only one involved. There may be others. This could be part of a much larger network. Nia looked around the neighborhood. Familiar faces now seemed distant, not because they had changed, but because she now saw them differently. With the eyes of someone who had been misunderstood, isolated, and judged, for being quiet, for being different. She turned and slowly walked back toward her home. Her hand paused on the doorknob, then opened it. Her eyes flicked toward the corner of the yard, where she had stood earlier, where it had all started. Her expression darkened, a flicker of doubt crossing her gaze. She knew this wasn't over. Kyle may have been arrested, but somewhere in the shadows of this story, something still remained hidden. A guiding hand? Someone else who had used the boy? Or maybe, a system buried too deep? A greater darkness might still be here. And maybe, it never truly left this neighborhood. Nia's story quickly spread throughout the neighborhood. It slipped into dinner conversations, into quiet sidewalk chats, and even through silent glances behind half-closed doors. Everyone heard. Everyone knew. And everyone had something to reflect on. What had once been considered reasonable suspicion now laid bare the truth behind indifference and prejudice. From someone who had the police called on her just for standing in her own yard, Nia became the only one who saw the real problem. She was the only one who stopped, investigated, and uncovered a crime creeping silently into every corner of daily life. No one expected that her sense of caution would be the thing to stop a widespread surveillance act, one that could have shattered the trust of an entire community. But what hurt Nia most wasn't just the invasion of her privacy. It was the isolation, caused not by strangers, but by those who lived right around her. Her silence had been misunderstood. Her discretion had been labeled suspicious. And her skin, though no one said it aloud, had drawn those doubtful stares faster than any other reason. Since that day, Richard was no longer the stern, confident man he used to be. He became quieter, more withdrawn during conversations. He no longer rushed to judgment as before. Every word now came with a pause. He had learned that sometimes, the things we're most certain of, can be the most mistaken. The residents of the neighborhood also began to change their perspective. They started greeting Nia when they saw her, offering gentle check-ins, recognizing her presence as a true part of their community. Gone were the strange looks, the awkward silences. They understood now, without her, they might never have known they were being watched every day. Nia continued living as before. She still worked remotely, still valued her privacy, and still rarely appeared at community events. But now, she was no longer pushed aside. She was respected. Not for speaking loudly, but for acting calmly, with conviction, and for having the courage to stand when others still hesitated. Following the incident, the neighborhood security system was reviewed thoroughly. Every home received guidance on how to protect their devices. People began to realize that safety didn't just come from locking doors, but also from digital awareness and being alert to even the smallest signs. What began as a seemingly insignificant story transformed the whole community. Not only in how they protected themselves, but in how they viewed one another. Because when a small mistake can lead to injustice, awareness, empathy, and mutual respect are what truly keep a community safe. Nia's story didn't end with an arrest. It left a lasting silence in the minds of those who witnessed it. It reminded us of something we often forget: we judge others too easily simply because they're different, quiet, or don't live the way we do. But sometimes, it's the familiar that hides the real danger. And the person we doubt might be the one trying to protect the truth. From what seemed like a small act, changing her Wi-Fi password, Nia uncovered a sophisticated invasion of privacy, raising questions about safety, trust, and how we treat each other in a community. If she had ignored it, stayed silent, or backed down in the face of suspicion, that neighborhood might have remained under surveillance without anyone realizing. So don't let prejudice blur your sense of justice. Don't label people simply because they're not like you. Be alert enough to listen, to observe, and fair enough to see the truth, even when it comes from the most unexpected place. If you found this story thought-provoking, please share it so others can learn the same lesson. Leave a comment, let us know your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more real-life stories with powerful wake-up calls. Because sometimes, an ordinary moment can change how we see the world forever.